This lecture is going to take a look at the interesting intersections between censorship and art and propaganda. And we're going to take a look at, as we start today, I want to take a look at some of the interesting developments that is happening within music between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you've probably noticed how I've been juxtaposing different themes, different topics as we've been taking a look at the Soviet Union and the common man, and then we took a look at the common man in the Great Depression with the United States, where we took a look at racism in the United States and racism within Germany. And this is giving us an interesting, I guess it's to design to help us to understand it. If we can understand how it's happening in multiple, these ideas are happening in multiple societies, it gives us a richer understanding to kind of see some of the similarities and differences. And so I want to continue that theme today as we take a look at how censorship is functioning within two very different societies. The first one I want to take a look at is Shostakovich and his Symphony No. 5. And Shostakovich is a Russian composer composing music during Stalin's reign. And we've taken a look at Stalin's strict principles for art. We specifically looked at his Soviet art and the major principles that each of the art was supposed to adhere to, where it's supposed to have a common style, glorify the workers, glorify the country, right? And similar styles happen, or similar kind of theme or style happens within music as well, where it's supposed to glorify the government. It was supposed to be, easy to understand. It was supposed to be optimistic and upbeat. And Shostakovich feels this oppression, and he has a desire to resist it. And so he composes Symphony No. 5, and then he has a performance of it. And that night that he performed it under this kind of strict totalitarian regime, he believed that he was going to be arrested and sent to Siberia. To a point where he believed it so much that he slept outside so that when the secret police showed up, they wouldn't disturb his family, right? So it's kind of interesting so I want you to think about why he would do this, right? Why would he undermine the Soviet Union when he knew the dangers, right? Why do you think it was worth it to him? Because after all, it's music, right? I mean, so it's kind of an interesting idea that, first of all, that Stalin believed that art was so important that he had to control it. And second of all, that Shostakovich felt that art and music were so important that he felt the need to resist, right? So it's kind of an interesting dynamic as we think about censorship. And this documentary here with Michael Tilson Thomas, he goes through Shostakovich's Symphony No. 5 and talks about some of the specific components of rebellion. And it's not going to be immediately, some of you might be music majors and probably can hear it a lot easier than those who aren't music majors. But Thomas is going to go through it a little bit more and help us to understand how this is considered rebellious. And then we get to hear from some people that actually lived under the Soviet Union and how they felt. And they're going to describe this oppressive regime.
Now, what better way for Shostakovich, under suspicion of being a reckless radical, than to begin his symphony with his own version of this time-tested opening? And then right here, only in the third bar of the piece, it all goes wrong. The music abruptly breaks off and then continues with a little scale, a kind of wiggle that shrugs its way downward. And then breaks off again with the appearance of those three fateful notes, the first dead end. So in the first 4 bars of the piece, we hear a pattern that occurs again and again throughout the symphony. Assertive statement, apprehensive retraction, dead end. Shostakovich has imprinted that ta-da motive on us. And now, in a film-like way, he transforms it. He dissolves it into this gently rolling figure. It seems to walk resignedly towards a distant horizon as it becomes the accompaniment for the next theme, which tentatively fades in. Why does this music sound so special? It reminds us of a folk song or Beethoven or Tchaikovsky, and had they written it, the passage might have sounded like this. But by changing just one note, Shostakovich has made it into this. What an amazing difference. Just changing one or two notes can change the entire meaning of the piece. And that's the essence of one of Shostakovich's methods. He evokes memories and associations of music that the audience would already know, but changes the musical language just enough to suggest what he's feeling, what they are feeling, but that no one would dare speak aloud. The repressive tone of the Soviet era is something a number of our symphony musicians know only too well. Over lunch in San Francisco, they recalled their experiences growing up in the Soviet bloc. Some actually played for Shostakovich, but all of them knew what he had faced as a musician living under Soviet rule. You yourself had occasions when you had to pretend that everything is wonderful and nice, even though it's not.
From the day when I started to talk, I knew that what you feel and what you want to say is not exactly the same thing. Even as a kid, I don't remember playing or dancing or anything. It was kind of a dark, pretty harsh.
In this society, we lost our feeling to express so much because people's afraid sometimes. Fear still live in this time.
A lot of my family members were taken to Siberia. So I seen a lot of cars driving on the streets, the black ones. I knew that friends from school disappeared with their families, so I could only imagine what was happening.
The middle section, or development of the first movement, creates a drastic change of pace and mood by jump cutting between extremes of range and instrumentation. And it all starts when the piano and basses come lurching in with a version of the dead end theme. Da, 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 da. From here on, it's all about winds, brass, and percussion, as if the orchestra suddenly had become a band. The music becomes militaristic, and it struts and swaggers and keeps driving forward in a way that recalls Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. Here's Tchaikovsky. Here's the way Shostakovich does it. Where is all this leading? To a pileup all the themes whipped along by the ta-ta motive until the strings and winds burst out with the sad tunes they played at the very beginning. But now those tunes are all connected up, and the orchestra screams them in what has become a terrible lament. And then the brass and percussion hammer home what seems to be the ultimate dead end. I can't think of a more powerful and frightening moment in all music. You find yourself thinking, how has it all come to this? How can we go on? Other themes wander in again, making their way back to the opening theme. A solo celeste creates a mood that seems fragile, and then in the very last bars we hear the ta-da motive, now fatefully scored for trumpet and timpani in a way that warns us that the struggle isn't over.
So just we think about this, right? Why would someone risk life and limb in order to create music, right? And it's kind of an interesting representation. I mean, if you want to take a look at Keeping the Score, it's a longer documentary. You watch it. It's fascinating. It's wonderful. And if you're interested in Symphony Number 5 by Shostakovich, I highly recommend listening to the entire score. But I just want you to think about why someone would do this, right? Why someone would push against censorship and oppression, living in a society where they feel as though they have lost the ability to express themselves. And maybe this is kind of Shostakovich, his desire to create. I mean, maybe we all have this kind of inherent desire to create. Maybe this is his way to kind of push through and to have his own voice be known. And so it's kind of interesting that someone would risk this in order to do this. I want to talk a little bit about Aaron Copland, who he is a Russian immigrant that comes to the United States. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to create music that was easy to understand. He wanted to create music that was the sense of the American spirit. And so here, what you're listening to in the background is Appalachian Spring. And so he wants to create this fanfare for the common man to glorify America's vast landscape, pioneering spirit. And these are similar ideas that we've talked about before when we talked about the Great Depression, the common man, where we saw the works of Dorothea Lange or Walker Evans. We've talked a little bit about Norman Rockwell and Frank Capra's films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or It's a Wonderful Life. All about kind of the common essence. But what's interesting about, I guess what I want you to think about in terms of Copland and in connection with things that we've already talked about with like Frank Capra, is the music that he creates is always upbeat, always optimistic, in a time of depression and hardships. So in some ways, his music is not truth. It's actually countering truth. That becomes maybe in itself, as it kind of tries to ignore the harsh realities, becomes less truthful and maybe more propagandistic because it's trying to kind of sweep the hardships under the rug and focus on some of the positive elements. But in other ways, right? I don't want to simplify that too much. In some ways, maybe this kind of hope and optimism was needed during a time of hardship and sorrow. So think about this music in connection with, is this more artistic as an expression, individual expression? Is it more propagandistic as it ignores reality? And then as we think about this in connection with Shostakovich in Symphony No. 5, right? We have Shostakovich who feels a need to express the harsh realities. And Aaron Copland seems to want to, I guess, turn away from them, albeit temporarily. So as you think about Shostakovich versus Copland, which one would be more art, which one would be more propaganda? So you think about art as an individual expression. It reflects truth, it reflects reality. Kind of an interesting juxtaposition between the two, and there'll probably be a discussion board on getting you to think about Shostakovich and Copland and the differences between their works. I wanted to end by taking a look at the Hays Code, which I had you read for today, thinking about censorship in the United States. And this is something we tend to not really think happens in the U.S., right? We've talked about censorship happening in the Soviet Union and censorship happening in Nazi Germany. But there's also censorship in the U.S. And so the first kind of form of censorship on the development of film, and this is to continue our discussion of the rise of film between this kind of new developing art form. In the 1920s, film was pretty much kind of is able to do what it wants, and so you see a lot of filmmakers that are kind of being a little bit more, risque or pushing the boundaries to a certain extent. And then in 1930, there's these strict codes that are going to be placed upon the production of film. What are known as Hays Code is not named after an individual named Hays. And this is kind of the principles, the underlying principles of the code that I had you read. And I've highlighted some of the main points that I want you to think about. That film has a high trust and confidence, right? And that because they have a high trust and confidence and they have a responsibility to the public trust. And so they have a responsibility to shape the public opinion. So we've talked a little bit about this when we talk about Birth of a Nation and how it's creating this vision, this alternate version of reality and history, but it's creating this sense of identity, right? And so the government's starting to realize how powerful film is, and they're starting to suggest that we need to do something about it, right, to kind of rein it in, right? That film has the value in rebuilding bodies and souls of the human beings. And I wanted to think about this in connection with, what's going on with how does Stalin see art, how does Hitler see art, right? This idea of needing to control it, right? Needing to restrain it because because they realize it's so powerful, right? So similar ideas happening to a certain extent in the U.S., right? Number 4, it's an important form. Film is an important form of art expression. It enters intimately into the lives of human beings because it's so, right, as Godard said, that it has this ability to tell truth and get us so immersed within the experience that we generally tend to think of it as reality, right? Number 5, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. As we think about films today, certainly there's any number of films that do that. But this is, again, the 1930s, and this will last until around the late 1960s or so. But it should portray the correct standards of life. The law, natural, or human should not be ridiculed, right? So these are all the strict qualifications that murder, the technique of murder must be presented in a way that will not inspire imitation. Methods of crime should not be explicitly presented, so you're not supposed to teach people how to commit crimes. So you're just supposed to allude to them. And then taking a look at the next one. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Adultery must not be explicitly treated or justified or presented attractively, right? So it's not to say that there can't be something like that, a theme in there, but it's supposed to be portrayed as negative, right? So again, as we think about this, how does this, measure up to other authoritarian kind of regimes that we've been studying about the strictness of what they want represented and why they want it represented, right? And so what might be the reason or the justification for this, and how might that justification be similar to or different from what's happening in other totalitarian regimes, right? Is this kind of a heavy-handed control? Do we like this heavy-handed control? Are we okay with it, or do we see this to be a problem, right? Seduction or rape must never be more than suggested and never shown by explicit method. Any type of sexual perversion or slavery or misogyny. Actual birth is out. Some of these aren't necessarily, bad. About, no children, no child nudity should be exposed, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of good elements that are presented here. But again, we have to think about whether there should be restrictions on art or not, right? That's a discussion that we will probably have on a discussion board or in a Zoom, right? Vulgarity should always be to the dictates of good taste, and obscenity is forbidden, so no swearing or lewd jokes or anything like that. Profanity is forbidden. There's no nudity or religion. No film or episode may throw ridicule on any religious faith. The use of the flag shall be consistently respectful. So thinking about some of the restrictions on, again, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, that everything was supposed to be respectful about the military, about the common person, about our rules, our way of life, our vision, right? Are there some similarities that we can glean from, right? So a couple of questions to think about is, how do you feel about codes that restrict artistic expression in any way, right? Or some people might be okay with that. Some people might not be okay with that, right? Some people might feel as though artistic expression should never be constrained, right? So I don't know. I don't know where you're at with that, but this is kind of the discussion within the Hays Code. And just to give you some context on the Hays Code, what would happen is that every film that was produced would have to go through the MPPC, right, the Motion Pictures Production Code, and then the person or a group of people would review the film, and they would say it either meets these codes or it doesn't meet these codes. If it doesn't meet these codes, then it's going to be rejected and kicked back to the director or the editor, and then they could make changes and then resubmit it, or the film would just be dead, right? But if it then passed, right? So let's say they made a film and then it passed the MPPC, then it would then be distributed. It'd be sent out to movie theaters, and people could watch it, right? And so it had to pass through this organization, otherwise it would not. And so there's some interesting ways in which filmmakers dealt with this. Hitchcock is one of them that had he kind of felt that this was oppressive, and so he would often try to see how much he can get away with. And in one film that he did, is Psycho, in the early '60s. He decided to put more into the film than he really wanted in there. So he did more shots and more scenes than he really wanted in the film. And the whole reason that he did this is when he goes and negotiates with the MPPC, they would say, no, you can't have this, you can't have this, you can't have this. He would say, well, you got to give me this scene then, and you got to give me this scene. And so he used it as more of a bargaining method. And one particular scene that they objected to was when Marion goes into the bathroom. She tears up a piece of paper, and then she throws it in the toilet, and then she flushes the toilet. And there's a shot where you can see the toilet flushing. And the MPPC said, yeah, you can't show a toilet flushing in film. And Hitchcock says, well, but you already cut this other thing, so you got to give me the toilet scene. And so he saw this as a means of negotiation. So finally, he got the toilet flush scene, and so he was happy about that, because that was integral to the film. Thinking about this, just kind of getting back to some more questions to think about. Stalin and Hitler wanted art to be moral, uplifting, and not to address the darker components of life. Do you think that there are significant differences between the Hays Code and those imposed by Stalin in Russia or Hitler in Germany? Or are the standards and or the objectives very similar? So this one's getting you to think about what are the similarities and what are the differences between the restrictions that the United States, right, the censorship in the United States and the censorship of other societies that we've studied, right? And then number three gets us to think more about this within the members of the church lens, right? As members of the church, we generally agree with most of the rules of the Hays Code and what it aims to accomplish. After all, we seek after wholesome entertainment. However, how do you feel about imposing regulations on others who may not have the same standards that we have, right? So many of the standards of the Hays Codes, I think most of the members of the church would say, yeah, I agree with that, right? I agree with those standards, and that's what art and entertainment should uphold. But should there be kind of this imposing our kind of standards onto others, right? And how do we feel about that, right? So these are some complex issues that we're going to have to really think about and consider as we move forward. And then number four, as members of the church, we do we tend to have stricter standards for what constitutes as wholesome film than visual art or literature? Do you think that film deserves its own set of standards? And what the Hays Code is arguing here is that film does hold a different set of standards because it's so intimate, because it's such an immersive experience. So thinking about that, do you think that film is significantly different than any other art form, right? Or should the same standards apply to all of them? It's kind of an interesting question we'll talk a little bit more about. And then looking at today's films, do you think that the filmmaker should return to upholding standards of the Hays Code, or is this too strict on artistic freedoms? How do you think VidAngel fits into this discussion? What happens is in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, they replaced the Hays Code with the current rating system that we have today. And so now we have the PG and R. Before, when it first started, it was PG and R, and then Steven Spielberg came out with a film in the 1980s called The Temple of Doom, and it went through the governing body, whoever kind of rates films, and they gave it an R rating. And Steven Spielberg says, "Yeah, I don't make R films," and he pushed it. He says, "No, re-rate it again." And so he kind of heavy-handedly pushed that to a PG rating. And then after that film, they said, okay, we need something in between, right? A PG and an R, and so they developed PG-13. So this is kind of an overview of our current rating system and censorship, and how it's kind of a tricky, it's kind of a sticky kind of topic that we need to kind of investigate as we think about the differences between what is art and what is propaganda as we move forward.